too much noise today. I just need the road, the rain, and the hum of the engine.
Have you ever felt like there's a part of you don't really understand? Like, you're not sure who you really are anymore? I've been there too. Let me share something with you. Maybe it'll help you see things a little clearer. I never really believed a home could feel like a person. Like it had moods, memories, even a kind of soul. But I swear to you, there was a time when I'd walk into my apartment and feel like I was suffocating. Not from a space itself. It was small, yeah, but cozy enough. It was something else. The air felt heavy. The rooms looked dull no matter how much sunlight poured in, and everything just seemed off. I didn't understand it then, but now I realized my home was holding a mirror to my insides, and it wasn't a flattering reflection. I was going through one of those silent breakdowns, the kind you don't talk about because nothing's technically wrong, but inside you're drowning. I kept blaming work stress, social burnout, even the weather. But what finally woke me up was this strange moment one night when I caught myself staring at a pile of laundry on the chair. The chair that becomes a second closet, and I felt this wave of grief. Not because of the clothes, but because of what they represented. That pile had been growing for weeks. Just like the unopened mail. Just like the dust gathering on the windowsill. And I thought, why does my life look like this? That night, I sat on the floor of my living room. The same spot where I used to meditate before I fell off every habit that once kept me grounded, and I cried. Not because anything specific had happened, but because everything had become so loud in its silence. I looked around and saw not just mess, but meaning. Every unwashed dish was a decision I hadn't made. Every corner was a chapter one hadn't closed. My home, without saying a word, was screaming for my attention, for my presence, for some kind of love. I remembered something I'd read years ago from Jung, something about the outer world being a projection of the inner world. I never fully got it back then. It felt too abstract. But sitting in that room, surrounded by my own avoidance, it clicked. My home wasn't just messy, it was mirroring my disconnection from myself. The clutter, the disarray, the lifelessness wasn't about being lazy or busy. It was about being lost. The weirdest part? I started feeling like my apartment was sad for me. That probably sounds ridiculous, I know. But there was this deep intuition that the space was aching, like it wanted to help me heal, if only I'd let it. If only I'd stop using it as a storage container for my numbness, and instead allow it to become a sanctuary again. So I started small. I lit a candle. One candle. I didn't clean. I didn't reorganize. I just lit it, sat with it, and breathed. The flame felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. And that was enough to crack something open. It's funny how one tiny act of presence can shift the whole atmosphere. Over the next few days, I didn't clean the house. I listened to it. I noticed which rooms felt heavy, which drawers I avoided, which corners made me feel like I couldn't breathe. It wasn't about tidying up. It was about tending to parts of myself I'd buried in those spaces. And with every object I picked up, every shirt, every old letter, every dusty book, I asked myself, do I still want to carry this version of me? Some things made me cry. Some made me laugh. Others, I just let go. Not because they were bad, but because I didn't need them anymore. They belonged to someone I no longer was, or maybe someone I never really had the chance to be. What I'm trying to say is our homes know us. They reflect us. And sometimes they're the first to notice when we're drifting. Before a friend calls, before our body gives out, before we can even admit it to ourselves, our living space starts to absorb the weight we refuse to hold. And here's the thing. Just like we can wound it, we can also bless it. We can speak life into it again. Not with fancy rituals or perfect aesthetics, just with presence, with intention, with a kind of reverence that says, I'm here, I'm alive. I'm ready to come home, to myself. That's what this journey became for me. Not just decluttering, not just cleaning, but remembering, reclaiming, realigning. And it all started with a room that wouldn't stop whispering, look at me. I kept going one drawer at a time. Not methodically, not like some productivity hack, just intuitively. I wasn't trying to organize my life. I was trying to feel again. And it's strange how something as simple as folding clothes or wiping down a countertop can bring up so much. Memories, grief, joy, shame. I realized I had stuffed emotions into objects without even knowing. An old photo frame buried in the closet made my chest tighten. A broken necklace I hadn't thrown away whispered something about how I held on to things long after they'd lost their purpose or their soul. At some point, I understood I wasn't just cleaning a house. I was making peace with versions of myself that were still scattered across shelves and drawers. Pieces of me I'd outgrown, others I'd forgotten, and some I'd never dare to meet. Each corner of my home started feeling like a page in a journal I'd never written, full of stories I didn't know I was still carrying. I'd read somewhere that the psyche doesn't like unresolved things, that even when we consciously forget, the unconscious remembers. And I think my home was holding all those memories for me, quietly, patiently, waiting for the day I'd be ready to face them. One day, while sorting through a box of random keepsakes, I found a journal entry I wrote years ago. It said, "I want a space that feels like peace." I had forgotten I ever wrote that. But here I was, finally trying to build that very space, not with furniture or candles, but with honesty, with presence. And then something shifted. I started noticing how different rooms in the house felt like different parts of my psyche. The living room, the social face I showed to the world, always curated, but often empty. The kitchen, where I nourished others, but rarely myself. The bedroom, my hiding place, where I ran when life felt too loud. And the closet, God, the closet, a graveyard of forgotten dreams and old wounds dressed up as sweaters. But the most powerful realization came when I walked into the bathroom one morning, half asleep, unshowered, and just stood there. The mirror didn't lie. I looked tired, but not broken. There was a softness returning to my face, a quiet defiance in my eyes. Like a part of me was waking up, the part that still believed in beauty, in balance, in becoming whole. So I started doing something small but intentional. Every morning, after brushing my teeth, I place my hand on the mirror and whisper, "This is still your home. You're allowed to be here." It sounds silly, maybe even childish, but that daily affirmation that I belong in my own space, in my own body, began to ripple through everything. I stopped rushing through the day. I stopped apologizing to myself for needing rest. I started lighting candles again, not for decoration, but as a way of saying, this moment matters. And as my home shifted, so did my mind. I stopped needing noise all the time, podcasts, music, TV, just to fill the silence. The quiet didn't scare me anymore. In fact, I craved it. I found myself sitting in the stillness of my living room, just breathing, sometimes crying, sometimes smiling. The walls didn't feel cold anymore. They felt like they were holding me. I think we underestimate the intimacy we can have with a space. We forget that just as we leave an imprint on the rooms we live in, they leave one on us. They remember who we were, but they can also help us become who we're meant to be if we let them. Looking back, the change didn't happen in a day. It was slow, gentle, but real. My home began to soften, to glow, to breathe again. And in that softness, I found something I hadn't felt in a long time. Safety, not from the world, but from myself. I was no longer running from who I'd been or who I feared becoming. I was right here, present, with all the mess and all the beauty, learning slowly to call this space and this self sacred. One night, I had a dream about my old childhood home. It wasn't a nightmare, but left me uneasy. In the dream, I kept walking through the same hallway over and over, doors on either side, all closed. I didn't open a single one. I just wandered lost, like I was searching for something without knowing what it was. When I woke up, the feeling stayed with me, that sense of being locked out of parts of myself. I remembered something I read about Jung's view of the house as a symbol of the psyche, that every floor, every room, even the basement, can represent a layer of our consciousness. And I started to wonder, what rooms in my own inner house have I left unexplored? What have I boarded up and buried? I thought about the basement of my current apartment. It's not technically mine. Shared storage, locked, mostly ignored. I hadn't been down there in months, but something pushed me to go, just to look. When I finally opened the door and descended the narrow steps, I felt a weight in my chest. It smelled like dust and forgotten time. And it hit me. This place feels exactly like that part of myself I avoid. The one filled with old stories I never wanted to reread. We all have those rooms, don't we? Internally. Parts of us that hold fear, grief, or shame. We don't decorate them. We don't visit them. But they still exist. And over time, the neglect grows mold. Shadows deepen. It's not the darkness itself that scares us. It's the idea that we left ourselves alone in it. I didn't stay long in the basement, just enough to acknowledge it, to say, I see you. And when I walked back up, I felt different, like I had touched something honest, something real. That moment changed how I looked at the entire house. The living room was no longer just a place for guests. It became a space where I could be with myself, fully, no performance, no distractions. The kitchen wasn't just for quick meals anymore. I started cooking again, not because I had to, but because it brought joy. Even a bathroom became a little temple for cleansing, not just physically, but emotionally. But the most sacred shift happened when I created a quiet little corner in my bedroom. Just a tiny shelf, a candle, a small plant, and a photo of someone I love. No altar, no ceremony, just a space that felt like a heartbeat. Every morning I'd sit there, close my eyes, and just breathe, not to achieve anything, just to arrive. It became my grounding ritual. 5 minutes, sometimes 10. Sometimes I cry. Other times I just feel stillness. But it always felt like I was returning to something I'd forgotten, that I don't need to fix everything. I just need to be with it. And slowly, the house, this physical one and the internal one, started feeling like home again. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was finally honest, lived in, loved. I began to see how the condition of my space reflected where I was emotionally, and vice versa. When I neglected myself, the home dulled. When I showed myself compassion, the home sparkled in small, quiet ways. A beam of light through clean windows. The comfort of fresh sheets. The smell of coffee in a room without rush. There's a kind of magic in creating sacred space. Not because of what it looks like, but because of how it feels. And that feeling, that resonance, started to guide me in other areas of life too. Conversations felt deeper. Boundaries became clearer. Even silence carried more meaning. I think, deep down, we all long for a home that reflects the truth of who we are. Not the polished, curated version, but the layered, complex, beautifully imperfect self. A home that doesn't just shelter us, it welcomes us, challenges us, holds us, teaches us, and maybe in tending to it, cleaning, rearranging, blessing it, we're really tending to the soul that lives inside, reminding ourselves that we're worth the effort. That presence is enough. That healing doesn't always look like breakthroughs or revelations. Sometimes it looks like lighting a candle in a quiet corner and finally feeling seen. One morning, as the light streamed through the windows in a way it hadn't in months, or maybe I just hadn't noticed, I felt something shift. Not outside, inside. It wasn't dramatic. No thunderclap or revelation. Just a deep, grounded knowing I was safe here. For the first time in a long while, I didn't want to escape my own space. I wanted to inhabit it, fully, consciously. That day, I started speaking to my home. Not out loud. Not like a conversation, but with intention. Every time I lit a candle, every time I opened a window or fluffed a pillow, I whispered a silent blessing. Let this be a space of peace. Let hold me with grace. It sounds simple, maybe even unnecessary, but something changed in the energy. The home softened, or maybe I did. I realized then that blessing a space isn't about rituals or traditions. It's about relationship. It's about declaring this space matters. I matter. There's something powerful about living with that level of reverence. About treating your environment not just as a container, but as a co-creator of your life. That weekend, I chose a small corner of my home to become what I now call my anchor space. Nothing elaborate, A chair, a candle, a soft blanket, and a few meaningful objects. A place where I could return to myself. I didn't go there to escape the world, but to return to it more whole. Each morning, I began lighting the candle and sitting in stillness, even if just for a minute. It became less about the act and more about the message. You are worth slowing down for. It was a counterspell to everything outside that screamed urgency, performance, noise. In that silence, I started to hear myself again. Not the anxious loops or the critical voices. The deeper self. The one that had waited patiently beneath all the layers. And that's when the blessing became more than a routine. It became a way of being. I'd walk through the house with slow, mindful steps, letting my hands brush the walls like you'd touch the shoulder of someone you love. I started saying things like, "May this kitchen nourish more than just hunger, and may this bed be a place of rest, not avoidance." Not because I believed the walls were listening, but because we often forget the power of speaking kind truths into the spaces we inhabit, of declaring what we want them to hold. And in doing that, we declare what we believe we're worthy of. As the days went on, I noticed something else. People who visited commented on how different the space felt. "It's so calm here," they'd say. "I feel like I can breathe." And they weren't just talking about the decor. It was the energy, the care, the presence infused into the space over time. The way everything had been touched by intention. And isn't that what we're all craving, really? Not just to live, but to live meaningfully. To feel like our space supports our becoming. Like it aligns with who we're trying to be, not who we were when we moved in. I began to see my home as a sacred collaborator in my growth. Not because it was perfect, but because I had invited it to evolve with me. I stopped needing to escape to feel spiritual. The sacred was here, in the way I folded laundry, in the music that filled the kitchen, in the sunlight on the floor at 10 a.m. It was all part of it, all alive. And so the blessing deepened. It became less about changing the space and more about changing how I showed up in it. With gratitude, with curiosity, with softness. Because that's the real secret, I think. When we bless our space with love, patience, and attention, it starts to bless us back. In little ways, in quiet ways, but in ways that matter. And one day, you look around and realize this isn't just a house anymore. It's home. Not just because it shelters your body, but because it finally reflects your soul. There's something humbling about realizing you've lived in a space for years without ever truly seeing it. Like waking up next to someone you love and realizing you stopped looking into their eyes a long time ago. That's what happened with my home. I hadn't noticed how much of it had become invisible, background noise to a life lived on autopilot. But now, with each passing day of mindful presence, the house began to reveal itself to me again. And in doing so, it revealed me to myself. One evening, I sat on the floor with a cup of tea, watching the shadows on the wall. The room was dim, quiet. There was nothing particularly special about the moment, and yet it felt sacred. I realized how little I had allowed myself to just be in the past. No distractions, no tas, no striving. Just existing in space, held, not judged. That moment felt like a reunion with something ancient. Like the part of me that remembered what it was like to be connected to the rhythm of life. Not through productivity, but through presence. My home had become my teacher. Each room a lesson, each object a mirror. And with that came an unexpected sense of liberation. I stopped trying to make my home impressive or aesthetic. I stopped rearranging furniture to impress people who never visited. I let go of the pressure to perfect. Instead, I asked myself, what feels like truth? What feels like home to my soul? That one question changed everything. I started surrounding myself with things that held meaning. Not expensive things, meaningful ones. A stone I picked up on a hike when I felt the most free. A letter from a friend who saw me when I didn't see myself. A blanket that smells like the arms of someone I miss. My home became an archive of my becoming. Not curated for others, but curated for remembrance. Even cleaning became different. It wasn't a chore anymore. It was an act of care, of reclaiming. I'd wash dishes and think, this is a way of saying thank you to the body that ate, to the day that nourished me. I'd sweep the floor and feel like I was sweeping away stale energy, making room for something new to arrive. There's a deep power in treating the mundane as sacred. It transforms everything. And then came the realization I hadn't expected. The more I cared for my space, the more I began to care for myself. Not in the performative, self-help kind of way. In a quiet, internal way. I became gentler with my own thoughts, kinder to my own process. I gave myself permission to slow down, to rest, to exist without justification. The home responded. It felt warmer, softer. And when I invited friends over, they'd comment, "It just feels peaceful here." I'd smile, not because I was proud of the decor, but because I knew what they were really feeling. They were feeling me, a version of me that had come home to herself. And I began to wonder, how many people live in places that silently reflect their inner chaos, their numbness, their longing, without ever realizing it? How many of us ignore the messages our spaces are trying to send? Because our homes are always speaking. They whisper when we're avoiding. They hum when we're healing. They glow when we're aligned. And when we finally listen, truly listen, they become something more than four walls. They become living prayers. They hold us, teach us, and if we let them, they help us remember who we are when the world forgets. That, to me, is the essence of blessing your home. It's not about incense or words or rituals, though those can help. It's about the intention, the relationship, the sacred decision to turn a place into a mirror for love, healing, and truth. And once you do, you'll never feel quite as alone again, because the space will hold you. And more importantly, you'll start holding yourself. The more I lived in this new rhythm, this slow, mindful communion with my space, the more I noticed something remarkable. My inner voice changed. It grew quieter, softer, less cruel. Where once there had been judgment, now there was compassion. Where there had been resistance, now there was curiosity. And I'm convinced that shift didn't start in my head. It started with my home. We don't talk enough about how the environment shapes us. Not just practically, but emotionally, spiritually. The way sunlight moves through a room, the way the air smells in the morning, the feeling of returning to a place that welcomes you. These things matter. They teach us how to relate to ourselves, and they shape the tone of our inner world more than we know. What began as an attempt to declutter had turned into a profound psychological realignment. I had stopped seeing my home as a burden or a project. It had become a dialogue, an active participant in my healing. And as I continued tending to it, blessing it, listening to it, I realized that the work I was doing inside these walls was no different from therapy. It was shadow work, integration, becoming whole. And the shadows, they didn't vanish, but they stopped scaring me. Because now, when I felt a wave of sadness pass through me, I didn't run. I'd sit in the corner of my room with a warm blanket and a candle, and I'd let it move through. My home had become a container strong enough to hold those parts of me. Not in judgment, but in love. There's something sacred about having a space that can hold your full spectrum. Joy, rage, grief, silliness, tenderness. A place where you don't have to perform, where you're allowed to crumble and bloom in the same breath. That's what this house became for me. A sanctuary not built of walls, but of truth. One evening, I remember standing in the center of my living room, hands open, eyes closed, and whispering, "Thank you." Not to a god, not to the universe, just to the space itself, for witnessing me, for holding me through it all. And in that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of connection, to myself, to the space, to life. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was present, rooted, alive. I started to notice how my relationships were shifting too. Conversations felt more honest. I had more patience, more grace. The peace I cultivated in my home began spilling into the world outside. My home had taught me how to listen, not just to walls, but to people. It had taught me how to create space, not just physically, but emotionally. And maybe that's the secret. When we bless our homes, we learn to bless our lives. We become intentional with what we invite in, and just as importantly, what we release. We clear out what no longer serves. We create room for newness. We build altars to gratitude, not on shelves, but in our habits, our words, our choices. This transformation wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was slow, subtle, sacred, but it was real. And it taught me something I'll never forget. When you tend to the space around you with love, that love doesn't stay in the walls. It seeps into your being. It changes how you move, how you breathe, how you love. And it reminds you, again and again, that healing isn't somewhere out there. It's right here, at home. It's strange, really, how something so simple can change so much. A room, a gesture, a whisper of intention. They seem insignificant until one day you look around and realize your entire life feels different. Not in some massive cinematic way, but in a grounded, unshakable kind of way. Like your soul finally found a rhythm that matches your breath. The final piece of this journey wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a final ritual or some great revelation. It was just a morning like any other. I was sipping tea by the window, wrapped in my favorite blanket, and I realized I felt at home, not just in the apartment, in myself. I wasn't waiting to become someone better. I wasn't fighting the past or chasing the future. I was just there, soft, awake, whole. And that's when it truly sank in. This space had become an extension of me, not a performance, not a coping mechanism, not a hiding place. A real, living environment shaped by the very love and presence I had denied myself for years. It didn't mean I had no bad days. They still came. But now my space held me through them. The soft light, the quiet rituals, the corners I had once ignored, now speaking in symbols of safety and care. Even on the hard days, I didn't feel lost. I felt anchored. I had built a sanctuary, not with money or style, but with attention. And that attention taught me one final, important truth. Everything is energy. The way we treat our space reflects how we treat ourselves. And when we change that relationship, when we begin to see our environment as sacred, we start seeing ourselves that way too. I used to think the phrase, bless your home, was something quaint or religious. Now I know it's revolutionary, because to bless your home is to claim it as holy. And in doing that, you begin to claim yourself as holy too. Not because you're flawless, not because you've fixed everything, but because you're finally willing to show up for your life in all its mess, all its beauty, all its quiet unfolding. So now, every time I walk through my door, I smile, because I know that whatever the day brings, this space will hold me. Not because it's perfect, but because it's mine. And maybe that's all any of us really want. To feel like we belong. To feel seen, not just by others, but by the very spaces we inhabit. To come home, truly home, to ourselves. And if that journey begins with a candle and a whisper, then let that be enough. Because sometimes the most powerful transformations don't start with a roar. They start with a room that says, welcome back. I've been waiting for you. They start with you saying, yes, I'm ready to be here now. And that changes everything. If this felt meaningful to you, it might mean something to someone else too. So hit like, leave a comment, or subscribe. That's how YouTube knows to share it with others. Maybe together, we can help someone see things a little differently.